so I am here to talk to you today a bit about JSPM ES6 and how we've used it in some real life projects. So first, I'll do a quick intro. So my name is Reid. I've been coaxed into doing this by Adam. I work at some point with Adam as a front-end developer. So I'm going to start off by having to try and rival the cat GIF game, because that was pretty strong to start with. But I think this is pretty good. Right. So if anyone can't clearly see it, that's definitely Nicolas Cage waving on the back of a car's windscreen. So I think for a hack night we might do a similar thing. So you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on my most viewed webpage on my website, which is my 404 page. Don't look at it now because it doesn't work on mobile. I blog over at BenjaminReid.me really infrequently, and I'm on GitHub. So my general thing is I just make things for the internet. So whether it's anything front end, I do a bit of back end as well, but generally I just like to class myself as just make things. So enough of that. So I'm going to talk a bit about JSPM, a bit about ES6, and then a bit about the real life use cases. So I was going to do the entire thing on JSPM until the speaker pulled out and realised that we have to fill a bit more time. So I'll go over JSPM, introduce it, see what it does, and then we'll actually jump around into some more of the technical bits of ES6, and also how to roll your own system if you don't want to use JSPM. So it's a bit of a show and tell, but it's kind of like I'm not completely sold. It's sort of saying this is just an option, that's all. So what is it? It's a package manager. Well, I bet you're all kind of thinking, not another one, right? Wait, there's one more bit. So the guy who actually came up with it, called Guy Bedford, he actually tried to, this was his pretty much one-line solution. He wanted to be able to install a widget or a library with one command and be able to require it once into a project. And what he means by widget or library is something like jQuery, Modernizer possibly, and just any other JavaScript library you can probably think of. And these slides are online, so this link's really good. This is a really good in-depth introduction into JSPM as well, so he goes over some of the technical sides if anyone's interested. So that link's worth checking out. So I kind of slated it saying it's just a bit of a package manager, which it is, but it does a bit more than that for you. So it is a package manager for System.js. That's how Guy Bedford phrases it. And if you haven't used or heard of System.js, it is, as we see here, a universal dynamic module loader. And basically what that means is it will load any JavaScript module, whether it's in AMD or CommonJS or the standard ES6 syntax. So it's not another package manager that has a separate repository and anything like that, so you don't have to sort of forget everything you've done before with NPM or something like Bower. So it actually leverages on top of the existing package managers, which is really nice. And again, we mentioned before that it will load any module format. Another big thing that it's really good at is those modules get sucked in and it will transpile your ES6 into ES5 code. And again, that obviously ties into all the ES6 stuff. And the last little thing is it also builds a production-ready file for you. So the kind of aim of it is it sucks down packages which don't necessarily have to be set up for ES6. Your code doesn't have to be in ES6, but it basically allows you to bring in modules that you would normally bring in from NPM or Bower. It allows you to load them in like you would sort of like a require.js kind of module, and it also does any ES6 compiling for you, which also means you can write the nice new ES6 module syntax. So, should you consider using JSPM or the like? So before we actually dive into it and show you what it does, the reasons what I started looking at it was I heard a lot of people, they complain about having this one monstrous JavaScript file, which you all probably come into at some point, where there's just functions everywhere. And I don't really write any particularly complicated code or anything that's really clever, but I like to make it so that if another person came to it, they wouldn't freak out and then, they're throwing stuff across the desk at you because it's just they can't understand it. So I got quite anal about getting into this module stuff and splitting all this code out into various different bits, and we'll see as we go along how that's actually quite beneficial for development. So JSPM gives you that. If you don't want to roll your own stack, you can get up and running really quickly. So it's actually a node module itself, and you can install it quite simply with npm. And then you actually you create a project like you would normally, so this is probably quite familiar to everyone. And you set it up much like you would an npm module. So you call JSPM in your project, and it sort of becomes a JSPM project. That doesn't mean that you're sort of tied into its complete ecosystem. So it's you can have it running alongside something else. So don't think of it like, once I'm in a JSPM project, that's like the be all and end all. So you install packages much like you would do with npm, and people are probably quite familiar with this. But can we have a hands up, anyone that's used npm or Bower? Most people? Yeah, good. Slide comes along. Hello. Well, that's sad, isn't it? Let's try again. Go on. Yeah, there we go. Well, that wasn't rehearsed. So you create an index file much like you would do an entry point for any of your apps. So typically, if you were doing your own project, you might have an index file, a PHP file, a Ruby file, and you might include your separate packages. So you might download them from Bower or npm, and then include them manually. You might include them in a build step, so they will get bundled together. But what this actually does, JSPM sets up this config file, and it scopes its own packages into this folder, much like you would see that npm does. So this basically brings in system.js and then does a little bit of magic in the middle. So we installed jQuery, and by default, if you were doing that with Bower or npm, it would come in as a global module. But when we do it with JSPM, it actually comes in and it's scoped within its own nice little sort of holding area, I guess. And then this is the ES6 style syntax for loading the module. So it's a little bit different to CommonJS or Require.js. But essentially you import, and the dollar can be anything, but typically people assign jQuery to a dollar. And then that string jQuery is where is where JSPM does some bit of its magic. So that's where it will go in, it will go into the packages, it will suck it out from there, it gets scoped into your little variable, and then this module here in app.js, if we can quickly flip back. So app.js, that's like a self-executing function. So on here, that as soon as that page loads, it's going to load in jQuery for you, scope it, and then it will be available to that module you've got here, which is app.js. And that's pretty much it. So that's why I had to extend my talk. So that should make you feel like this inside. If anyone doesn't know, that's Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation. There was a cat gif from that same show earlier on. As a bonus, it also allows you to create production-ready files. So it's doing quite a lot for you. It's allowing you to leverage npm and Bower. You can even set up your own registries on it if you wished. But it's essentially allowing you to bring in modules and just work with them nicely. because if you were doing it sort of the other way, you might bring in jQuery, and then you've got the global jQuery variable. But jQuery may be a bit of a bad example because most people typically deal with it on a global level, but something that doesn't want to be able to escape, and you want to include it to a module specifically, is quite a strong argument for using it. So, what does the other side look like if you don't want to delve straight into JSPM? Well, it can look a bit like this. This had so much more context last week. So I'm going to give a quick example of how you could sort of achieve the similar thing but using Gulp, and you could apply the same thing to Grunt or any other task runner. So you need quite a lot of dependencies. You also need Gulp itself. You need something called Babelify, which is what does the ES6 to ES5 transpiling. We need Browserify to do some nice importing and sort of wrapping it all up for us. And there's a few other sort of quite non-interesting Gulp plugins in there. The other important one is Bower. So we're taking into account that Bower will be our main package manager for this, and a few others. So first we're just going to set up a little function that pulls in our dependencies from Bower. So this is using a really nice little npm module called main Bower files. And what this does, it goes over to your Bower JSON where you've got all your dependencies saved. It sucks them all in. It creates an array, and all we're doing is filtering out for any JavaScript. So you might do the similar thing for CSS if you've pulled in JavaScript and CSS modules. After that, we move on to the Browserify sort of level. So this will take any ES6 and ES5 code, and it sort of munges it all into one file. So in comparison to JSPM, when you're actually running that system.js line in development, if you open up your console and look at your XHR logs, you'll see that it's loading in each file every time. But what this is actually going to do is going to sort of do all that, work out where the dependencies have to be injected into the files, and it will just appear in one big file basically. So it's kind of making sure that if one module needs jQuery or Modernizer or whatever it may be, you'll make sure that it's at the top before your module needs to use it. So after that, we just got one sort of housekeeping task. So this will just take the dependencies sort of stream, and it will take the script stream, which is doing our ES6 compilation. It then sticks those together, and then we can just output it to our disk folder. And that ends up looking a bit like this. So yeah, it's slightly long-winded, and if you don't know how to do this initially, it can be quite a painful process. I went through various different things getting this to all work correctly how I wanted it, getting it to output one file and stop processing multiple files and stuff like that. And moving that across projects is also a bit long-winded. So the pros and cons, you've got a bit of a manual setup if you do it yourself, but that can also depend on whether you like doing it yourself as well, because some people do. And you can also structure it how you like. So that's another thing that eats away at me, where I've got past the code stage and I'm just sort of working, well, do I want this in this folder? Do I want to sort of bend to the rules of this other tool? And that could obviously affect your workflow across teams, because you might have an internal workflow, but JSPM, not to say that it doesn't have the flexibility to do that, it can just be another red herring that can cause a slight complication. So this is sort of a pro and con. So when you look at the, as I mentioned before, the XHR log, when it's sucking in all the different files, with the sort of Gulp solution, it's only ever getting one. So you're still getting all the code. You're getting a bit less sort of runtime latency, so you're not waiting for all the files to be sucked in before it fires off the sort of main call. But with both of them still, they both all come with source mapping. So if you've written your code across, say, 5 different modules, it will stick a source map at the bottom. So when you get an error, or you just want to browse the code in the web inspector, you'll be taken to your sort of individual files in development. So it will all transfile to ES5, but it will be source mapped a bit like Sass goes back to CSS. And you don't get a free build script, which you do with JSPM, which is kind of nice. And again, I've played around with using Gulp and JSPM in conjunction because I guess, again, the JSP one's a bit opinionated, and if you're not used to it and you've got your own process, it can get in the way. But I think the key thing, especially between the two, is that JSPM does the scoping really, really well. And it just feels like it's solved that problem. Whereas, just trying to think of a good example of a module that you might pull in that wouldn't be very happy in the global scope. I mean, we use StoreJS a lot, which handles the local storage stuff. I mean, it can sit in the global scope quite happily, but it's kind of nice when you're pulling it in and people come to read your code and you can see that, oh, they've actually pulled this in for a reason, which is again quite important when you're going back and reading it. So it's kind of technically good, and it's good for your brain as well. So I'm still kind of split. I haven't actually run a complete project with JSPM. I've definitely done the DIY method, and I'm still sort of torn between the two, and I'd really like to do a project where I'm full on using JSPM, using its own modules, and it still has a few more advantages with the registries as well, because if anyone's seen NPM has also got private repositories, so you can pay for your own private repos. You can even set up your own internal private repo for your company and register that internally with JSPM, and you can suck down those files for free. So it leaves you feeling a bit like this guy. Yeah. So to go with the bonus round for this, a bit of a shameless plug. I was a bit bored the other day of rewriting this code over and over again with Gulp, so I just set up a little project so that it would handle ES6 compilation. So instead of those 10-15 lines you saw, you can pretty much do your ES6 compilation with one line. So that's free to anyone to use, even though it is scoped to my name, but it's kind of like that because I wouldn't expect you just to use it. I mean, you can, it's not private or anything, but it's more that you're free to fork it and do all the tweaks that you need to do to it, and then you can publish your own version, or you can make an open source one that's a bit more global on NPM. But a nice thing to mention quickly about this, not blowing my own trumpet too much, is all the task does, it just returns a pipe. If anyone's confused by the kind of weird look, because it looks a bit weird, you normally start off with a gulp source, but that's just doing that, returning a pipe, and then you can do your minification in a build script if you need to. So that's just another nice thing. So, who's used ES6 before? Not too many people. Won't be boring that many, but yeah. So this quote from Luke Hoban, I think sums up ES6 quite well. I like to compare it to, I guess, HTML5, where they've added various different APIs and attributes and elements that can sort of die a bit happy in older versions of browsers. So it's kind of like a nice progressive enhancement on JavaScript. But that's not to say it doesn't have its quirks. So a good question to pose is, can I actually use ES6 now? Because I was asking this a long time. It's almost like those CSS3 properties that come along. You're like, oh, can I use bulk shadow? Will I get sued? But as you can see, there's a lot of red. So that's where the transpilers come in. So things like Babelify, which is the browserify version of Babel. And just to recap, Babel is the ES6 to ES5 transpiler. But I think the transpilers feel like they're going to be around for quite a while, because I can't imagine that none of the ES6 features work in IE. I'm not sure if it says here, but I think that one's IE10. Quite a lot of red. There's not much hope for anything lower than that. But there are a couple of caveats that you can sort of get around using the ES5 shim and sham. They get around the so when you transpile the code, Babel will nicely drop in some ES5 features that Internet Explorer won't sort of accept. So if you start using modules with ES6 and you transpile that code with Babel, it will start putting in ES5 code that IE doesn't like. So you'd run into that same problem if you were doing your own code in normal, general ES5 JavaScript. So that just helps sort of shim over it, and we've got it working down in IE8 and IE7. So, but the bottom line is, should you use it? Personally, I think yes. I've seen no downside to actually using ES6. You do have to set up the transpilers, and from a workflow point of view, if you've got Gulp or Grunt or whatever you're using, people shouldn't have to worry about it, because just like HTML, they can just write standard JavaScript and people don't have to care. But if you want to use it, it does offer you some advantages. At a low level, it will give you some advantages, but I think it's just nice to write some code which feels a bit more, feels a bit more grown up. So the first thing, which is quite heavily tied to JSPM, is the modules. And I'm not going to go through every single ES6 feature, and I tried to pull out some actual code we'd used in production projects, and I tried to take them out of the context that they were in, and it didn't work as well as I thought it was going to work. So I'll just give you there are some examples where the code is sort of reduced a little bit. So the first block of code here is the definition for an ES6 module. And a module is just a separate file. So you've got, say, main.js, and this one might be hello world.js. Well, as you can see, it's just hello. And this just lives on your system. It's a separate file. It doesn't live within the other one. It's completely separate. And this would be sort of your bootstrap file. So it would be the file that you would run when you run your index.php, the first thing that gets run. And it imports this module here using import hello. And that hello there can be absolutely anything. You could rename it, you could rescope it, you could put in an object, you could do whatever you like with it. And this bit here, that's simply telling it to suck in that file. And then you can just call it. And just doing that alone, it looks that example is a little bit useless. But when you actually start putting in helper functions and functions that you were like, oh, where the hell do I put it? You could just actually start to split your code up, and it's really good for your brain. So this is a slightly more practical example. So we built a really, really small router. So this sat here, and it exposed the root as just a standard variable, which is the index, and then it also exposed an object with a couple of functions to define what would happen when you visit the two roots. So this line just here is extracting both the different variables from that file. So if you needed to get the index root into your router, you could do. If you needed to use it somewhere completely different, you could do that as well. But in this example, we've just got the sort of bootstrap file. It's importing the roots, which is kind of, if you lay this out differently, you could have like app router, and it could be hidden away in your document. Then if anyone needed to come along and add another, like a different root, they'd only need to be concerned about with this file, so they could just go in there, they could add a new one, edit one, and they wouldn't have to bother mucking around with the router. So that can be completely detached from that code and not really care about it. And this is sort of the example I was talking about with helper functions. And this is really good because there's never really a place for these. I mean, I used to create like a helper.js and sort of include it at the top level. But this is really good for when, especially if you're loading the code like per page, you can sort of import parts of the file. So you don't need to import the entire thing. So say like you only wanted a certain one, you could just request that particular function from the helpers into another file. But in here, this is again our bootstrap file, and we're using star. So what this does, it scopes all these functions, because they're sort of named rather than being anonymous functions, and they're scoped this what becomes an object. So helpers gets turned into an object, and you've just got access a bit like a class, which we'll come on to later. But that's been one of the most handy use cases for modules. So the keyword error is modules make your life better, and I can't see a reason why you want to use them because they're good. And talking from a point of view where it helps your brain, if you've got a problem, much like you've been splitting out SAS, you've got a module that does a particular thing. If there's an issue with it, more than likely you can open your text editor, do Command P, and you can jump directly to the file that you need to debug. Again, I'd really suggest looking at that link. It's got some really crazy details of what you can do with modules. I've sort of covered the basics, but you can do some pretty other cool stuff. So classes, the closest thing I can compare them to is CoffeeScript. Who likes CoffeeScript? Not very many. So, actually, who's used CoffeeScript? So that's a good sign there. The classes really seem to have been taking a big influence from CoffeeScript. And if you were to look at Coffee's version of classes, they turn themselves into like their prototypal JavaScript functions. So they're very much play to being reused and saving memory and stuff. But in ES6, this is a very simple example of a class. And these can also be used in modules. So this is really handy. So we've got actual proper classes in JavaScript, which is something the language hasn't had. Well, it's never had. And I'm not sure, like some people are really against it because they're like, it's a functional language, does it need classes? But I think it's just the way you think about it, and my brain sits happy with classes, so I kind of like it. But with the classes, we also get extends, which is also really nice. So another big thing, it is a pain in the ass if you want to extend something and get it all set up right. You can do some sort of quick fixes to get extending working, but this does it really well. You get constructors, again, something we just haven't had. And also you've probably noticed it looks like I've just missed some code out, and I was like sort of writing this, but that is the actual syntax. There's no mention of function. The actual function definition is literally just a keyword, and then your sort of your brackets. And it's also got, as you can see, we've got a static function as well, so they can be called just on the app without creating a new instance of it. And there are tons of other different things that classes can do, and they take quite heavily. They can use constants and all sorts of stuff, but again, I'm not going to take you through every single thing because we'll get around it. Arrow functions are really nice, especially if this binding really hurts your head, and I know it hurts a lot of people's heads, and it hurts my head still. But what this is sort of doing is typically, when we go inside a window bind event, this reference gets lost. It gets turned back to the window. But what this is doing here, so again, we're missing the function keyword. We're then using a fat arrow, which again was taken pretty much straight from CoffeeScript by the looks of it. And what it does in the background, it basically creates a reference to this on the line above, much like you might have done underscore this or self or something, and then reference it below. But just by turning that from a normal function into an arrow function, it just sorts the binding out for you, which on its own is really good. I mean, they do a little bit more than that, but that's a good case for using them. So a 3-in-1. I'll go through these individually, but quickly we've got a sort of like default arguments. We've got better interpolation, and there's also, I forget the name. I think this is like assignment deconstructing or something, but I've got the name for it there. So default parameters are really good. Here we can actually see what the ES6 would look like in comparison to the ES5. And again, this is just if you've ever dealt with default parameters, passing in objects and stuff like that. If you're writing modular code, default parameters really come in handy. And I mean, the code comparison is just so much more readable. Like you can sort of look at that and go, oh, I know what it's doing. The interpolation has got a bit better. I still can't say that word. And again, this was, you see this in most other programming languages. That you see it in Ruby, you see it in PHP. If you've used Coffee, it's a very similar syntax to that. And this stops us looking like we're using math instead. Property value shorthand, that's what I was looking for. So this is a bit of a convenience thing, and I kind of like it, but it's one of those things that also makes, if you've never used any of the ES6 stuff before, it's one of the more unreadable things. So open and close are actually functions, which we saw in a couple of slides before, and we're returning or creating a methods object. But instead of having to define the named keys and pass in the function as well, it just does it for you. Which again, it's just a bit of a shorthand. It's kind of quite nice. You just say, yeah, I know they're going to be the same. Don't worry about it. And you can do some other very clever stuff with this, but I much suggest you go check out this link. So this covers pretty much all of the ES6 features in bullet points, and you can skim read it in like half an hour on lunchtime. It's really good. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Does anyone have any questions?
I've not used the transpiler before, if I've said that correctly, but does it just convert everything into ES5 so it doesn't like give good browsers good code and then...
No, yeah, it's literally like taking your SAS and just turning it into CSS. So, like you've seen those ES6 examples, yeah, it really just does, like Coffee. Like Coffee was just a made-up syntax.
Yeah.
But at least if you're using ES6 and you're going to transpile it down to ES5, in theory, if you're using a browser or a project comes along, you just chop the transpiler off and your browser should just make it work. But yeah, it just does munge out code that works in ES5. Any more? All good?
I can't get out. That's my feet. Huge thank you to Ben.
Thank you all for listening.